In 1909, British author P.G. Wodehouse released The Swoop, a fanciful tale about a sudden invasion of England from all sides. This was a satirical take on a genre that was popular in Britain leading up to World War I, invasion literature, in which an enemy, usually France or Germany, surprise attacks Britain and successfully lands on the island. What separated The Swoop from more hysterical stories was the sheer number of combatants who decided all at once to invade England. The list of those who ultimately invaded includes the Russians under Grand Duke Vodkakov, the Germans under Prince Otto of Saxe-Pfennig, the mighty Swiss Navy, a force sent up from Monaco, a band of Moroccan brigands under Rasuli, an army of young Turks, the Mad Mullah from Somaliland, the Chinese, led by Prince Ping Pong Pang, and finally, the Bollygollans paddling up in their war canoes. Fortunately for the British, against this great host, a young Boy Scout named Clarence Chugwater managed to break up the enemy alliance by getting them to argue among themselves, eventually just getting them all to leave on their own. The story was never meant to be anything but good fun. After all, where was the Royal Navy? But as fanciful as it might seem to a Victorian or even modern audience, that England would ever be invaded, at the height of the 100 Years' War in the Middle Ages, an enemy alliance really did invade England. And, kind of like the Swoop, during that invasion, enemy bickering amongst each other did more to doom their joint invasion of England than any army the unpopular English king could put together. This is the story of the French in Scotland. Contrary to popular belief, England has been invaded several times throughout its history. Its existence was not that of a tranquil island, carefully cloistered by an all-powerful navy, protecting England from any foe and keeping it aloof from all Europe since the time of William the Conqueror through Brexit. Far from it. 3 kings were crowned in England, backed up by foreign armies, including 1 French prince and 1 Dutch ruler. And raids across the Channel during the long 100 Years' War between France and England were not unheard of. England's Royal Navy really only ruled the waves for about 150 years, and yet, due to its relative recency, when most people think of invading England, it's to laugh about Napoleon's vain attempts to cross the Channel, or Hitler's planned and scrapped Operation Sea Lion to invade England. Or, if not laughing, then trying really hard to show how they could have pulled it off. Back in the Middle Ages, France and Scotland were bound together in a pact known in Scotland as the Auld Alliance. The 2 realms agreed that should ever the English attack one, the other would launch their own attack in England's rear. The strategy was a sound one, especially for smaller Scotland. From the time of its signing in 1295, Scotland had based its entire foreign policy on the alliance. It coordinated its movements with France to strike the English in the back whenever they turned to the continent. More still, Scottish knights served on continental Europe to assist the French kings directly, and were admired by their French counterparts for their bravery. France coveted the English dynastic lands of Normandy and Aquitaine, and 100 years of war were fought to seize those lands while defending against the English attempts to take the French throne. Whenever there was a break in the fighting, the 2 allies would both have a seat at the table, giving each greater leverage than either had alone over their mutual enemy. After 9 decades of fruitful cooperation based in France, it was decided by Scottish King Robert and French King Charles VI that the campaign of 1385 would launch instead from Scotland. A plan was formed that a group of French knights would sail from France to Scotland, from which they would work with the Scots to raid the English borderlands. That year already was a bad one for England, with the unpopular English King Richard II, the very much not lion-hearted, struggling with domestic turmoil. Forcing Richard into open battle on his own land would further embarrass the king, who was already having a hard time keeping his own peasantry under control. And a land assault from Scotland came with other advantages. For the French, they would get a crack at striking at the English homeland directly, from a safe and secure land border. For the Scots, they would be able to rely on French military expertise to take critical castles currently controlled by the English. Deciding this campaign was sure to be a win-win, a large force was assembled in France, consisting of 1,500 swordsmen, mostly knights, 300 crossbowmen, and various other support troops. The French king placed the experienced admiral Jean de Vin in command of the expedition, who set sail with 180 ships in the summer of 1385. As mentioned previously, the English navy was not yet the behemoth it would become in later centuries, so the only real threat to the French fleet was the weather. Most armies of the period were not much larger than 10,000, so the 2,500 or so French that eventually arrived in Scotland was a sizable contingent, and as important as the men they brought were, the French also came with critical supplies for the campaign, including horses, armor, cash, and other goods that could not be reliably found in Scotland. At that time, Scotland did not have the capability to manufacture many of its own metal goods, so things commonplace in France, like horse bridles, would in Scotland have to be imported from makers in Flanders. As a result, there was likely to be more expertise and equipment in this raid than any that had come before. The English were not aware of this buildup on their border. Desperate to disrupt this dual force, England preemptively invaded Scotland with a huge, and hugely expensive, feudal army. The king hoped that with such a massive force, he would break up the Scottish army before it had time to assemble. The English army crossed the borderlands and advanced as far as Edinburgh, the Scottish capital making a nice stopping point for the semi-annual English invasion and picnic. However, they were unable to find any Scottish, let alone French, to fight. After a long debate among the English commanders in which Richard finally won out, the English decided that they didn't want to go chase the Scots around in the Highlands. They would just have to settle with some pillaging and cattle rustling before going home, disbanding the army of peasants so that they could go home and work on their lord's farms. The way was now open for their enemies. But despite the English withdrawal, things were not all merry in the Franco-Scottish camp. The French knight's arrival in Scotland turned out to be a little like visiting the home of your work friend, only to discover why that friendship should stay at work. The French decided they liked the Scottish knights a whole lot better serving in France than in Scotland. But it may be hard to view the perspectives of those that were there through a modern lens, which through, at a glance, may assume medieval life was pretty similar for everyone, everywhere, with the only thing changing is the amount of mud on one's surcoat. So, instead, let us use our imagination and assume the point of view of a French knight who has accompanied the expedition. You are a French knight. You were born in 1355 to low nobility and spent most of your adult life fighting the English in a war that your father and grandfather had likely fought in themselves. There aren't many battles where you meet the English in an open field, for that always seemed to end in disaster anyway. But you did regularly raid, riding around farms and villages that were loyal to England and burning what you could not take, with the occasional siege of a castle here and there to break it up. Life isn't all war, of course. Even in 100 Years' War, there is the occasional truce. And during that time, there's always something to do. You may attend a tournament, cheering with your friends the latest champion of the joust. The bigger towns, too, always had wonderful nightlives, with hotels and taverns where you could always find something to do. You've probably even been to Paris at least once, and marveled at the size of the city. Paris was one of the largest cities in Europe, after all, some 300,000 people, at a time when rival London barely had 50,000. There are plenty of hotels and restaurants to accommodate you while you visit, say, the massive Notre Dame Cathedral, which had just been completed some 40 years ago. But the best part was that wherever you went, the people all around you understood both your language and customs. So life has gone on just as it always has, with fun and glory in and out of the war. But then one summer, you were presented with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to travel overseas. There was a plan to raid England itself, and you were in. Alongside your Scottish allies, whom you have long served with, there would be adventure and riches, and a chance to tap into rich English land that had not yet been plundered clean. Perhaps there would finally be a battle in English lands, finally wiping away the humiliation of the lost Battle of Crécy and its pesky archers. And best of all, in the lands of your loyal ally, there would doubtless be a grateful populace who would treat you like a count, if not a king. And so, you set off with your eager comrades and loyal page, sailing through the grey waters of the Channel, up the coast to Flanders, and thence to Scotland. The voyage goes well enough, minus the unfortunate death of a fellow knight. He decided to pretend he was a monkey and climbed up on the mast, but unfortunately fell off the ship, slipping forever beneath the waves in his heavy armor. It's tragic, but there's nothing you can do. One less to share the Edinburgh hotels with, eh? Scotland was ahead. It was time to see what this misty highland had to offer. The fabled land of warriors beyond Rome's Hadrian's Wall. And well, at the very least, there would be plenty to see in the capital. Not Notre Dame, perhaps, but surely Scottish knights had their own splendid spots to spend time in. It is only when you step off the ship in Scotland that you begin to realize that Edinburgh's claims to being the Paris of the North were, blindly optimistic at best. Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, only had 400 houses, no hotels, no restaurants, and not even any food for you. Comrades began to wonder if the admiral was mistaken and had accidentally dropped you off at some tiny Prussian garrison town in Eastern Europe. But no, this was indeed Scotland, that place where all those brave Scottish knights had come from. And the king was not in right now. He was running around in the Highlands somewhere, but he had left a message. You and your friends would be split up into many, tiny, outlying villages because the capital simply would not be able to feed 2,500 people gathered together in one spot. And so, you are packed off, and after a long ride, are put up in a thatched hut with a hard bed and naught but horrible beer to drink. No word from the Scottish king, so you won't be going anywhere soon. Inevitably, you still do have to feed yourself, so you send out your servant to go get you some food. He returns, but reports sadly that as soon as the vendors at the market realized he was a foreigner, they raised their prices tenfold. He could barely get away with an egg. Well, the only thing you have left to do is send the lad out to forage. The villagers at least gave you permission for that. You wait and wait on your hard bed and bare hut, fancying the taste of game and grain. But it never comes. You make do with more moldy bread and bad beer. Eventually, you're able to find a local who you can fumble through a conversation with. He informs you that the villagers, after letting your servant go out and collect the food, as is normal in France, simply waited for him to do all the work, come back along the road, slay him, and take the food and your horse. What a pity. He was such an expensive horse after all. The experience of this night we just roleplayed was not atypical for these French on what turned out to be a very bad vacation. Indeed, it is based on an account that a knight actually wrote. But besides the unwelcome, if not unexpected, cultural and linguistic clashes, the French were overcharged, harassed, and even murdered when they tried to do something as simple as buy food. And it went on for weeks. Having expected to start the campaign in England as soon as they landed, they were forced to wait around in what to them was squalor for several weeks while the Scots pulled themselves together. And the king came back from whatever he was doing in the mountains. And for their part, it was the Scottish people who had to put up with this foreign force when they barely had enough to feed themselves. They did not want the French here. The French made no secret of how they despised their poor country. And while the French were loitering about, they had a habit of riding their horses side by side in these huge lines, either when hunting or practicing for battle. These rows of foreign knights would trample down the Scots' crops, destroying their food for the winter. That moldy piece of bread and bad beer the French knight in our story complained of was about all the Scots had to eat. While there was certainly opportunism in overcharging the French at the market, much like a tourist today, there simply wasn't that much surplus food around. So, a new hungry mouth that could not even converse with them properly was going to have to pay up. And so all in all, things were miserable for both sides that warm Scottish summer. But, at long last, King Robert came down from the Highlands. It was finally time to do what the French had come here for and raid the English. And the Scots did come through with their part. Joining the 2,500 French, 3,000 Scottish soldiers were added to the campaign, largely financed by the gold the French had bought. Over their armor, the Scots wore black surcoats with a white St. Andrew's cross sewn onto it. This splendidly arrayed force assembled had grown far beyond what was needed for a mere border raid, and excited French planners carefully crafted a campaign that would maximize this rare opportunity to strike England directly. They would be stepping into a conflict that Scotland and England had long been fighting. The border war between the two realms had for generations been a very back and forth affair, one side gaining an advantage for a few decades, before the other side gathered the strength to push them right back. The focus of the two kingdoms wasn't so much as moving lines on a map, but rather something more concrete: castles. Controlling border castles gave whoever controlled it a secure base for raiding into enemy lands, and it left a dangerous fortress to the rear if any enemy ever tried to simply go around it. And All in all, there were very few pitched battles of the type that occurred on occasion in France, where each side brought out their army and fought it out in a field. Rather, the focus was more on incrementally bettering their position through raids and skirmishes. The Scots hoped to use their French allies to do something a bit more permanent than burn down a few farms and take a few cows. They hoped to siege an English castle. Their ultimate prize would have been Roxburgh Castle, a hill fortress at the junction of two rivers. In the past 70 years, it had changed hands 4 times, and after letting the English have a few decades, the Scots wanted it back. However, the French, after reviewing the fortifications, decided that an assault on the castle would lead to far too many casualties in their own army. They told the Scots that they were willing to attack, but only if they could keep the castle for themselves. The Scots, in what was probably a rare moment of British unity with their English counterparts, decided that the French having a castle in England was a bit too much. So they gave up their hopes of seizing Roxburgh and contented themselves with the usual plundering of the area. With the Scots' primary target now out of the question, the expedition looked around for something else to do. The French, who were still itching to fight the English in their own lands, were frustrated by the Scots' contentment to simply raid around. They wanted to humiliate the English on their own lands with a grand battle or a big capture. There was no glory in sailing all the way to Scotland just to steal some cattle. To their delight, a new target presented itself in the form of Wark Castle, another border stronghold that had flipped into English hands. Unlike Roxburgh, Wark Castle had fallen into disrepair, and it would be feasible enough to storm. After all, no one had the time to sit around for a lengthy siege. The Scots, though, were hesitant. They did not want to waste time or men on the crumbling castle, which still had defenders, and so argued against it. But their ally would have none of it. Unable to bring the Scots around, the French simply stood up in the middle of the argument and assaulted on their own, while the aghast Scottish stood back and watched. It turned out to not be the quick and glorious victory the French had craved. The castle only fell after 2 days of bitter fighting. Building ladders, the French hurled themselves up at determined English defenders, engaging in hand-to-hand combat on ruined wall tops. The French took heavy casualties before finally capturing the castle. Vengeful for their losses, the French massacred the garrison and burned down the surrounding buildings. But at least they let the Scots have the smoking ruins of the castle when they were done with their damage. With the strength of their army expended on work, the expedition returned to Scotland. They had only been gone for 2 weeks. With little to show for their voyage up north, and loathing spending another moment in smelly Scotland, the French decided that they would just go home. But the Scots would not let them get away so easily. Angered at the damage the French had caused to their own fields, made worse by the debacle of the 2 castles, the Scots refused to let the French leave until they had compensated the Scots for the damaged farms. And so they held the Admiral Jean de Vin hostage for 6 weeks in Edinburgh until ransom money had been sent from Paris. When he was at last released, de Vin cursed Scotland from his ship as nothing more than a land of wild beasts, forests, and mountains. In the end, the joint invasion of England accomplished little more than what the Scots could have accomplished on their own in a typical raiding seasons. What had on paper seemed like a doomsday scenario for England, their 2 perennial foes teaming up to descend on them from the Highlands like Mongols sweeping across Europe, ended up defeating itself barely over the border. French distaste for the living conditions in Scotland did more to get them to leave than any English activity, which, in the event, was quite minimal. The old alliance, though still held to by both countries, lost some of its former luster, and Scotland no longer coordinated its foreign policy in lockstep with France. And so in the end, England was saved from another invasion of its fair isle, that it shared with the Welsh and the Scots. And this time, it did not even need a clever Boy Scout to get its enemies to bicker among themselves.